Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Avi, and I help run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into discussion of Sunjeev Sahota's new novel, China Room, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Searching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until after 94 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Whiten. We want to thank all of you for your support. With our loyal communities of book lovers and authors, we wouldn't be here today. Tonight, we're thrilled to have with us Sunjeev Sahota for the launch of his new novel, China Room. Sunjeev Sahota is the author of Ours Are the Streets and The Year of the Runaways, which was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize and the Dylan Thomas Prize, and was awarded a European Union Prize for Literature. In 2013, he was named one of Grant's 20 Best of Young British Novelists of the Decade. He lives in Sheffield, England with his family. Joining Sunjeev in conversation is Karan Mahajan. Karan Mahajan is the author of Family Planning, a finalist for the International Dylan Thomas Prize, and the Association of Small Bombs, which was shortlisted for the 2016 National Book Award, won the 2017 New York Public Library Young Lions Fiction Award, and was named one of the New York Times Review's 10 Best Books of 2016 and 2017. He was selected as one of Grant's best young American novelists. His reporting and criticism have appeared in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, Vanity Fair, the New Yorker Online, and other venues. He teaches at Brown University. So without further ado, please welcome Sunjeev and Karan to the stage.
I hope everyone can hear us. It's wonderful to be here with Sunjeev today. He's going to read in a little bit from parts of the new novel. But before he starts, I just wanted to say how much I loved this novel. And I just found The China Room to be hugely moving and immersive. And a true sign of that is that a day after I'd read it, I woke up wondering why I was thirsting for this particular kind of Indian rural world. And I thought maybe it was a memory of mine or a scene from a movie. And it took me a few minutes to recognize that this was just the imprint or the after image left by this novel, which has such a deeply imagined physical and social world. And for those of you who've had the luck of reading Sunjeev, his writing is characterized by a total mastery of physical and sensory details, as well as by its economy, tenderness, and wisdom. One thing about this novel, which I hope will come out in some of the stuff that Sunjeev reads, is that it's also very funny. And he very successfully transliterates the earthiness and crudeness of Punjabi into English. One of the descriptions of this book is that it's about one of his great grandmothers, but don't let that fool you. This novel has some of the most foul-mouthed female characters to stock a novel that I've ever come across, and that's very entertaining. It's also a novel about two generations that I felt has something new to say about the immigrant experience, movement between classes, and the difficulty of being freed by love. So without further ado, we'll get Sunjeev to read to us, and then we'll have a Q&A, and at 5:45, I'll start taking questions from the audience for Sunjeev. Thanks, Sunjeev.
Hi, thanks, Karan. I really appreciate that. It's a great pleasure to be here with everyone in this new world. I'm just going to read just for a few minutes. I'll be right from the bat, from the beginning of the book. So the book, as Karan suggested, takes place across two narrative strands, a 1929 strand and a 1999 strand. There's also, which is all framed by an older narrator from 2019. And the bit I'm going to read is from the 1929 part, and it's, as I said, from the beginning, so it doesn't really require much in the way of context. Okay, so here goes. Mehar is not so obedient a 15-year-old that she won't try to uncover which of the three brothers is her husband. Already, the morning after the wedding, and despite nervous, trembling hands, she combines varying amounts of lemon, garlic, and spice in their side plates of sliced onions, and then attempts to detect the particular odor on the man who visits later that same night, invisible to her in the dark. It proves inconclusive, the strongest smell by far her fear, so she tries again after overhearing one of the trio complaining about the calluses on his hands. The concentration is fierce, when her husband's palm next strokes her naked arm. But then too, she isn't certain. Maybe all male hands feel so rough, so clumsily eager and dry. It is 1929. Summer is erupting, and the brothers do not address her in one another's presence. Indeed, they barely speak to her at all. And she, it goes without saying, is expected to remain dutiful, veiled, and silent, like the other new brides. Spying from her window, she sees only the brothers' likeness. Close in age, they share the same narrow build, with unconvincing shoulders and grave eyes, serious faces that carry no slack, features that follow the same rules. The three are evenly bearded, the hair trimmed short and tight, and all day they wear loose turbans cut from the same saffron wrap. Most hours the brothers will be out working the fields, playing, drinking, while she weaves and cooks and shovels and milks, until those evenings when Mai, their mother, says to her, raising a tea glass to grim lips, "Not the china room tonight." Later, her husband says, "You're used to this life now." He strokes Mehar's ankle bone with his thumb, back and forth, back and forth. It tickles, and she wants to move her foot, but knows she mustn't. She can see nothing of him. When he stepped across the room and lifted his knee onto the bed, he moved through blackness. Still he strokes her ankle bone. It's as if he wants to say something, or perhaps she's the one who should be doing the saying. No, you'll know when to open your mouth. We went to see the priests. Ah, children. Pearls. I need to buy pearls. If you keep them under the bed, you will swell. Blow. A boy. Yes, she says, after a moment. She thinks she hears him nod or sigh, and before he departs, he closes his hand around her entire ankle and presses. Alone, Mehar exhales with relief, rising in the same breath, and reties her hair into the nape of her neck. Children, she thinks, and sits very still in the dark to discover what she really feels about the prospect. On the one hand, the sooner sons arrive, the sooner her presence in the house is secure. Not everyone is as forgiving as her father, willing to overlook a wife who can't birth males, refusing to switch her for another who can. But then again, once their child comes, her few moments of peace will be gone. At least now, when Mai's out, she and her Vance can steal across the yard for a nap in the shade. What hope for that when her son is latched to her breast? Mehar's hand goes to her neck, protectively, as if only now appreciating the luxury of being alone with herself. Another minute passes, 2, until she knows she must go, and she drapes her chunni over her head, ready to yank down the veil should she need to. She opens the door, and the cool marble meets her feet, as she steps outside. She feels suddenly alive, enough to levitate into the night, and it is an immense effort to remain grounded, here in this horseshoe of a yard, with the 3 doors all opposite. Which did he enter, if any? Mehar descends the 2 steps that take her beyond the overhang of the veranda and onto the outer yard, where she knows to duck for the bats flying overhead and to avoid the deep divot to her right, walking a path between the washing line and the charpoys piled against the wall. At the unmarbled entrance to the china room, she places her fingernails in the one spot where the door can be prized open and not make a sound. She does all this without pause or misstep, because in a purely practical sense, her husband is right. She is already used to this life, to this small world of hers, which is, she is now saddened to recall, just what Monty said would happen. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sunjeev. So, since you read this particular section, the question I wanted to begin with is a question of how one writes successfully about a family myth. I know in your case, this was a kind of based off a sort of overheard story or kind of a oft-told story about your great-grandmother. How did you avoid making that a very pious tale. What impressed me, as I said in the introduction, is how earthy it was. It's full of sex and intrigue in a way. It's not. It doesn't seem to be trying to protect the characters, even though they're historical characters from your family. So, what was there resistance to that? How did you get to that point?
There wasn't. I didn't feel any. Perhaps this doesn't reflect well on me. I didn't feel any compunction that I needed to hold my punches, or that there were places where I couldn't go. I suppose it's that splinter of ice that's often spoken about that writers have to have. I did feel a hesitation around what right I had, or what right anyone has, to attribute words and feelings and behaviours to people that really existed and people that have no right of apply. Like that, I know there are writers who disagree with this, but I do feel that kind of responsibility, even if they're dead. I think there is a feeling of that something is owed to them, and so which led me to questions of authorship. Actually, I think the way I dealt with that, firstly, I reconciled myself to the idea that this wasn't an imposition. I wasn't forcing my voice into her life. It was an act of, I was trying to do an act of, or make an act of generosity towards it. It's an act of love from this, to this ancestor of mine, by trying to imagine what it might have been like, or one version of a story that might have been as a very fictionalized story, and be that as it may. And the second way I did it was by including those questions of authorship into the very form of the book. I think it's an open question about who is actually telling this story of Mehar, this very constructed tale. Who's actually, is it the unnamed narrator? Is it an external, some external omniscient narrator? So those kinds of questions of authorship kind of allowed me to kind of navigate that question of authorial responsibility and authorial rights. I think, regardless whether it's my grandmother or whichever real person I might be writing about.
So you mentioned the sort of authorial perspective, and of course there is this other part of the novel, which is a first-person narrator who seems purposely drawn very close to your life. Like, I hesitate to call it autobiographical, but certainly you're playing with that. The name of the narrator is sort of S dash, very similar, working class background, parents work in a shop. I have to say I loved that section. I was really impressed by the sort of tenderness and honesty. And for those who haven't read it, it's about an 18-year-old from Britain, South Asian British, who's recovering from a heroin addiction and goes to this farm where he starts maybe imagining his great-grandmother's story. Had you ever written something that flirted so closely with autobiography? Did you feel any particular dangers in doing that? I'm sort of interested always in the dangers of writing fiction.
I think my first novel was, from my 3 novels, if anyone ever asks me which novel of mine they should read, I always point them towards my second, because it's the one I feel most distance from myself. It's my first novel and this novel that I feel that when people do read it, they get some kind of X-ray version of me kind of presented to them. So my first novel, the emotional posture of my first novel, the sort of the travails of that young man in terms of what he feels about his family, ideas of shame and guilt, that's, I can very much identify with those, and I always feel slightly anxious when people tell me they've read that novel, because I just feel they've had an insight into me.
I know how that feels.
Yeah, it's quite odd. I tend to just try to want to run in the other direction when I meet someone who says they've read that. And with this book, the also fictional strand, I'd say, allowed me entrance into that historical narrative. I started writing the novel purely in that 1929 place, and it quickly, the novel, and I thought I was going to write this big 1929 novel which looked at immigration and the independence movement, and I very quickly got bored of it, really. I think which isn't surprising. I find that kind of uninflected historical fiction quite tedious to read, so there's no reason why I should be good at writing it either. But once I found this auto-fictional strand, once I started writing that particular strand, which is, as you say, there are correspondences with my life. It is a version of me, and I saw how those strands were connected, not just by motifs and signs and echoes and mirrorings, but also the fact that both protagonists searching for connection. That kind of enabled the novel to come alive, and I didn't feel any. While I was writing, I didn't feel any trepidation at all. I think you know when a novel feels alive, and you know when it's got a certain urgency and a vitality, and you just have to go with that, even if it's taking you into what might feel like embarrassing or dangerous territory. I mean, there's an argument to be made that you write the best fiction when you feel closest to that moment of embarrassment, that moment of real revelation. The kind of the trepidation on the nerves only came once it was done and I realized it was going to actually be published. That's when I did feel and continue to feel a degree of anxiety. Yeah.
And you talked about how you'd conceived this novel as sort of a larger historical novel set in 1929. And also, I came across a couple of extracts from interviews that you gave, I guess, when your last novel had come out, Year of the Runaways. And I think you've said that you were kind of working on novel 3, which you expect to move away from autobiography to reveal the influence of South American magic realism. In another interview, you say it's set over the course of 100 years. It's set in England, but has a kind of unnamed location, a slightly fantastical place. I'm wondering about that process of drafting, whether that was a different novel you were referring to, or that's the same novel, and there was a way in which you were moving away from realism and you found a kind of roundabout way back to writing realism.
Yeah, so these are the pitfalls of talking about your work in progress before it's actually,
Well, it's interesting for an interviewer.
Yeah, before it actually gets anywhere. I love surrealism. I'm really into writers and painters like Leonora Carrington and that kind of vibe. So I started off, my original conception of this novel was going to be a novel that took in place the surrealist idea of the doppelganger and the double, something like Saramago's book, The Double, and obviously Dostoevsky, that kind of motif really has a real potency in Indian mythology, but in other kind of folkloric world as well, as a kind of a harbinger of danger. And I was thinking of the novel kind of taking in this surreal aspect. And as I say, so I started off with that 1929 novel, looking at it in that through that kind of lens. And then that novel kind of died. I didn't want to write a historical novel, whether it was going to be magical or anything else. So I genuinely thought that I wasn't going to return to that book. I told my editor that the novel's gone, I'm going to have to work on something else. So I slowly started writing another novel, which took place kind of in the future. I wanted to get as far away from an historical narrative as I could. And it involved kind of an older version, it sounds quite strange, an older version of me in it. And I did that to kind of actually just to try to make it come alive. And also because projecting myself into that strand felt like that's kind of an interesting thing to do, but a way to actually make the novel talk about the present in a way. If I can just put myself in there, it enables me to actually talk a bit more about the world directly around us, which is something I'm kind of like to do. But then slowly that novel, that kind of older version of myself slowly became closer and closer to me now. And I realized that actually I was still talking about doppelgangers, but the double had become me, in effect. I had become that doppelganger in the narrative. And so I was writing this book with this version of me inside it. And it was going nowhere. I wasn't quite sure where it was going, but it was doing certain things. And then in 2019, my father had some surgery, and I went back to give my parents a hand in this store that they ran. And I guess it'd be just being back in that family home where I grew up, living up at the shop where I grew up. It was triggering, I guess is the word. And that's very much in the novel as well, that moment of the character going back to his parents, sitting down and feeling as if the past is rushing up into his head, not just the past, but all sorts of pasts, as he said. And then from that point on, I realized that the story I was writing had connection similarities with this historical story, which I'd started writing about 15,000 words of 3 years previously. And that's when both halves kind of came together, and I kind of started seeing them as a whole. So I did, as you say, very much, I almost like backed into writing this novel. It's very different to the novel I originally thought I was going to write when I started it in 2016.
And you say something interesting about your process as well in another interview, where you talk about when you reach a stage when it feels like the novel has lost its vitality and urgency, you spend time in solitude trying to understand why it falls apart. And you said this happened 3 times with the China Room, and the 3rd time it was 9 months before you felt you could start again from the beginning. I want to know what those 9 months are like, and what's going on. Like, how are you spending your time? How do you know something's wrong? Do you, I personally, I always panic when I hit those states, and I always like to know what other writers are doing to get through that.
Yeah, no, I don't. And I remember very clearly, it was that writing. I was writing that second strand of the novel with with kind of the version of me that was slightly older, but getting kind of closer to me. And the book, it did. I mean, it's impossible to say. I can't really quite articulate that when you hit a point in the novel, though you know something's wrong. When is it just a wobble that you know you can get over and move on, and when is it something that's a much more profound kind of like bereavement? I guess when the novel is actually just dead, it's just dying. I don't know how you know it, but you know it. I think you know when it's gone. And for me, it happened the 3rd time I was in China Room. It was. I remember quite clearly. It was a summer. It was August. I was alone at home. I had a few days to myself, and it was gradually over 3 or 4 days. The novel was just petering out. I could just feel it under my fingertips. Doubts were creeping in, and they weren't going away. And then I spent some time just alone with my thoughts and trying to think, can I get over this? Is it going to come back, or is it actually gone? And at the end of that process, I think I knew it wasn't going to come back. And then I just wait. I think I had to just carry on with my life. I kind of teach creative writing part-time. I have young children, and just wait for a certain amount of critical mass to accumulate once again. I knew that I knew the general direction I wanted the book to go in, but I just didn't know what it was going to be. And it wasn't until May, when I went back to stay with my parents, that it all sort of started to come together. And I don't think it would have come together at that point had I not gone through those previous years of things falling apart. I think that, I kind of still feel like I was just, for 4 years, I was kind of like walking around kind of a darkened forest, just going along the same paths, retreading my steps, just trying to find the center of the forest, to find the clearing where it would be revealed. And it kind of happened in that May month when I went back home.
That's super interesting. I had a question too, which naturally I think comes up with your novels, of research, because the physical world of 1929 is so richly imagined. I think it's like the characters are always performing some kind of activity, basket weaving, dung collecting, painting, drumming. Like there's a lot of knowledge of, there's a great scene where people are sloshing around in an indigo vat.
Yeah.
How do you go about coming up with those sensory details? Are you reading old newspapers? Are you talking to people? How do you recreate? There's a scene in which a guy is riding a mule through a marketplace, and like you get all the different shop signs, and it seems really accurate to me based on whatever little reading I've done of that era. So yeah, what's the process behind it?
Well, I think you put your finger on it. It's the idea of movement. I do think if you show characters being mobile and not just kind of standing in aspic, they do have it gives a certain belief in what they're doing. And you see that I think movement is really important in kind of making characters feel vivid and alive. I've been going to India and to a very rural part of India where my family still lives, and that farm is still there. And since I was 6 years old, I used to go on an annual basis in the summer holidays, and it's less frequently in recent years. And I suppose a lot of the practices and the habits aren't that dissimilar. I know somewhere, I've seen that process of indigo dyeing still occurring in a village in India, which is so certain things. It's a cliche to say that India lives in several centuries at the same time, but it is also, I think, from what I've observed, also quite true. Some traditions, practices, modes of behavior, modes of thinking haven't changed so much. And I guess I am just naturally just a very inquisitive, probably quite nosy in people's lives and how they live and how they go about. So I suppose it's just years of talking to people about how they sort of exist. I never looked at newspapers, or I never feel like I've done any active, proper, shoe leather, proper research. It's very much what I've gathered over the years and what I can make the reader believe. You can have someone riding on a mule and going through a bazaar, and then it's just a matter of looking, isn't it? You're just looking at that scene as if you are there and seeing what will they see and putting it down on the page and adding those things like movement and color and a certain richness, but not too much. It can also, it can become overbearing, and then the reader starts believing it as well. But hopefully I'm just good at that kind of noticing aspect of writing.
And does it take time to get it right? I'm thinking of, I was very convinced by a depiction of the sexual mores of 1929, like the women are afraid to even ask their husbands a question while they're in bed together, right? Or like one character is thinking, this woman I'm sleeping with is very shameless. She's not appearing wounded the way like a woman should after we've made love, based in 1929 in a very conservative society. And I know that's where imagination comes in, but I'm curious about whether there's a process by which you're getting closer and closer to that kind of mindset, or if you can remember what that's like.
I think those were the scenes. Given that a large chunk of the novel is about the way Mehar comes to recognize that she has every right to feel desire and have control over her personhood as much as anyone else, it was important that those scenes felt honest and felt true. And I think almost I think it's in those scenes where where Mehar feels most like the Mehar of my novel and the Mehar of my, not the real figure that she's kind of loosely based on, but it's in those intimate moments where she feels most mine, I think. And perhaps that gives a certain freedom to the language or the sensory aspects of those kinds of scenes, which hopefully then is transmitted to the reader. So I think it's just being able to have the freedom to kind of go there. And as I say, I think I'm just quite shameless in that I don't feel anything stopping me from going there, and I don't think why I shouldn't kind of explore how all these characters are affected by the oppressions that are laid on them.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. It seems like this is one thing a novel can do, right? Is so we come from backgrounds that are very silent and repressed about a number of subjects, and you're uncovering or just describing a very normal aspect of people's lives, which goes unremarked. But which leads me to another question, which is that question of this sort of paradox that writers like you and me, I'm also from a Punjabi background, find ourselves in, which is that we want to sort of burst the taboos around certain subjects with our novels, but of course then we have the culture around us and our parents and our family occasionally reacting. So I'm interested in how that's been for you. If you're writing about the sexual lives of like women in 1929, or even honestly about like how British South Asian men can be depressed and alienated and be drug addicted. What has the reaction been in the community or in your family to your writing?
I think, if I'm honest, my kind of my writerly self and my writing, it doesn't really register that much with my family. If I'm totally honest with you, they're not. I'm not from my family aren't. My wife's a reader, but my wider beyond that, my family aren't particularly bookish. I don't think anyone has actually read any of my novels. I don't think. And say, if I'm honest, that's probably by design. I mean, I've probably encouraged that. I don't want them to read my books because of that idea of I'm exposing myself. I'm not really bothered about exposing the culture or feeling like I'm breaking taboos or what they might think about it. I actually think my family has quite a sophisticated conception of fiction that it would be fine. It's the idea of actually feeling that they'll see into me something that I just rather than not. So those questions don't really arise, as I say, partly because I don't create a situation where I'm not there handing out copies of my book to my family at weddings or anything. Unless someone asks me, I don't even tell them I've got a novel coming out. It's just not something I feel completely. It's not a discussion I feel totally comfortable with. Yeah.
Seems like a smart strategy, I think. I had a question also about Punjabi and dialogue, right? Like, to me, one of the most entertaining things in the book is that, as I said in the introduction, people are so foul-mouthed, right? Like, and that's something you do see sometimes in Punjabi villages, or the kind of earthiness of Punjabi diction. You have Mai, who is kind of an amazing sort of terrorizing character, who's like, she opens her mouth and like the crudest things come out of it. Like, did you?
She's a monster. She's a total. She's a victim as well, but she's also a monster. Yeah.
Yeah. But so, do you? This is the classic question in South Asian diasporic or South Asian writing, which is like each writer has to come up with a strategy for translating their native tongue into English when they're writing a novel in English. And what is your strategy? How do you deal with that?
That's interesting because I've taken a different approach with this novel than I did with my previous novel, The Year of the Runaways. So it might be useful if I just outline what those approaches were and why I felt they needed to differ. So in The Year of the Runaways, there's a lot of untranslated or Punjabi, transliterated Punjabi in which things aren't explained. They're not really often, they're not. The context doesn't give away what the meaning is. There might be just slabs of translated Punjabi it's just there, and the reader kind of accepts it as the soundtrack to the novel, and if assuming they don't understand it, and just moves on. And there was a lot of, or some kind of talk or criticism that a glossary would have been good, or some help around what was meant by these terms. The reason why I took that approach to dialogue and language in the Year of Runaways was, or one of the reasons, I guess there was a political reason for doing that as well, because no one asks white writers to make their language comprehensible to an Indian audience, so why the reverse? But a more artful reason was that it was a story about young men economic migrants entering England who didn't understand the signs and the symbols of the world around them. And I wanted to put the reader in that position as well. It's a story about insiders, and I thought the language needed to reflect that. And one of the ways of creating that was by making the reader feel a little at sea in some instances. In China Room, however, there's hardly any Punjabi words in it. Actually, there's maybe one sentence. Even I use the word charpoys instead of manja. Deliberately, it's a very anglicised word in China Room, whereas in Runaways, I'd always use the word manja, which is, is a woven string bed. And the reason for that in China Room was, again, it's that question of authorship and who's telling the story. In my eyes, it's a story being narrated by the unnamed narrator, the 40-year-old who's writing backwards the story of himself at 18, but also the story of Mehar. There's a reason why Mehar's story is very neatly constructed into 40 chapters. And so it felt right that one of the ways in which the novel points to that question of authorship and him authoring it was by making the language, but not allowing the language to be complicit in it becoming purely Indian. It needed to straddle both the English and the Indian aspects of it. So I wanted the language to be more reflective of the English narrator, I suppose.
That's a great answer. Thank you. That leads me to the next question, which is, how do you think you've changed as a writer from the previous book to this one? Like, were there any breakthroughs, any things you had not liked that you wanted to do better, or just some discoveries you made?
And I do feel that with my first two novels, they were, first novel is kind of a classic first novel, but, kind of drawing on autobiographical elements in kind of like it's first person, as many first novels. I like it. I like the novel. Yeah, no, I do like it. And my second novel was kind of me doffing my cap to those big Russian novels that kind of made me fall in love with reading in the first place. And also to, I suppose, some of those big Indian novels, which kind of really made me just feel kind of emotionally kind of like hollowed out when I first read them in my late teens. And I wanted, I suppose, writing kind of a large book in a very classical kind of 19th century vein. It's my way of paying, this is all obviously rationalizing in hindsight, it was my way of paying tribute to that. But those two novels are very much about kind of my past. They're also both novels that are interested in form and structure. And with this novel, I think if something has changed, it's that my kind of fascination and love of form and the novel form, and trying to deform that medium takes, or is more foregrounded, I'd say. I do feel like with this novel is the novel that I'm finally just starting to hit my stride a bit more, and I think that, because form is the thing I always first respond to when I'm reading anything now. Rather than content or any other aspects of form, and language tends to be what I kind of a hanker for most in what I read. I feel like that's probably going to only continue, and perhaps even continue and just be emphasised even more in future works. And perhaps, I'm wary of saying what I might, given what's happened in the past, I'm wary of saying what I might work on in the future. But I think it feels quite certain that interest in form is only going to develop.
And I thought this novel was very formally successful, I have to say. I enjoyed the sort of original, the kind of bifurcation and the kind of 70-year gap. I'll ask one last question before we open it out to the audience, which is to do with this question of influence. And I think this will also touch upon form a little bit. So I know, you've talked about in the past that you didn't really start reading till you were 18. You had this, seems to me, a wonderful summer of beginning your reading life by reading Midnight's Children, A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth, The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy, A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mistry. Such great, all of them are such great books. I was wondering what your reading experience has been with South Asian diasporic writers in Britain. Do figures like Hanif Qureshi or V.S. Naipaul sort of hang over your shoulders as people who have been to places or been in environments of the kind that you've been in, have grappled with the kinds of formal questions that you've grappled with? If not them, who else? Are you reacting to them? That's what I'm curious about.
Naipaul was there in the early days, certainly, and not just his fiction, like House Mr. Biswas and A Bend in the River, I suppose, especially the kind of the bleakness of that novel, I really kind of fell for in quite a big way. And his prose, I find the crystalline kind of nature of his prose is something that I respond to really strongly. But it's not mainly kind of I don't think I find myself, probably because I started reading quite late, I've never really needed that sense of seeing myself reflected in fiction or the Indianness. I think it's absolutely important that we do see ourselves reflected, and I think especially in your formative years and your adolescence, that's really important. But the books, or the writers, I should say, that I feel most closest to are the ones who have a style or a kind of or look at ideas of form in a slightly slanted or oblique way. I'm a real fan of, just to back up, it's really interesting. I only noticed or thought of it recently that the first line of my first novel is "At last the page is stained," and that struck me. I thought my first novel it's a guy kind of writing a journal, and he starts off with "At last the page is stained." And it strikes me that is very much how I see the act of writing. For me, I have a great reverence for the blank page. And I do feel that when I'm writing, I am staining that page. And if I must stain it, it's something I have to approach in a very cautious and highly sort of discriminating and careful way. And that gets presented, by my work kind of being economical or spare, or and those kinds of things, which I think is true. But I think what I most value is a certain terseness, a certain hardness in the language, combined with a kind of a bleak lyricism. I guess I'm thinking of, to come to question, writers like, Coetzee is an obvious one. His later stuff in particular, I find really, really strong. But also writers like Helen Garner, Australian, poet like Les Murray, Tim Winton, another Australian. Maybe Australians are my thing. I don't know. Maybe I should be Australian. But that kind of, I'm not a splashy writer. I guess I don't like to spill a drop. And there's something, I get something from that terseness is the best I can, kind of that terse lyricism is the best I can come up with. So the writers I respond to tend to be the ones that write in that kind of stylistic and formal vein, I think.
That's super interesting. Well, thank you for answering all those questions, Sunjeev. And now I'm going to pull up the chat over here and see what some of the people in the chat have been asking. Fatima Das asks, what authors? Okay, so we just talked about this. What authors inspired you to become an author? If there's anything else you want to add to that, you should. But the second part of this I'd be interested in is, are there any South Asian authors you always recommend to people?
I do recommend Rohinton Mistry, especially his novel A Fine Balance. I read it when I was in my late teens, and it was the first novel that I think I just felt devastated by. Those four characters, Om, Manik, Ishvar, and Dina, kind of have stayed with me. And though I'm feeling if I read that book now, I'd feel differently about it, which is why I don't recommend rereading those books from that you loved in your kind of like in your formative reading experiences. But I think it's a novel that is kind of enthralling and immersive in the way that it's kind of like, you know, it's one of those books that just made me fall in love with reading. And I feel every reader's probably had that experience, and that's probably mine. Naipaul, of course, but also actually just writers writing in Indian languages. So Ravinder Singh Bedi, I really like his novel Ek Chadar Mein Ali Si, which I think is a beautiful, beautiful novel, and just about dignity and shame and sex as well. Or a novel like Pinjar by Amrita Pritam, which looks at the partition of India through the eyes of this really mercurial, brave young woman called Buro. And there might be a bit of that in Mehar in China Room as well, but also those writers I think are well worth reading as well.
We have a question from Alison Lawrence, who's actually my editor, so it's very nice of her.
Oh, wow.
And works with your editor at Penguin as well. She asks, I'm curious about what you both have to say about literary South Asian diaspora tradition in the UK versus America. Like, I'll pose this question to you. Do you feel like there's like a difference in the kind of works or the angles of the works that are being produced in the diaspora in the US and the UK?
Well, I feel like in the UK, and I don't know, I'm not qualified to talk about the US so much, but in the UK, it's still very much, you know, I mean, there's that relationship with empire, isn't there? And it's still very much writing out of that wound. And certainly, I mean, and you know, the immigration that happened following the independence of India to England, families which, and many of which, like my family, were affected by partition, and as a result of that, it's almost like they came to the UK, the second migration, to make sense of that first forced migration. There's a lot of pain around that, which I think British Asian writers are kind of still writing about, and I certainly feel with my novels, it's not lost to me that all three of my books kind of do deal with questions about what it is to be a migrant or a child of migrants. And I don't know if Indian American writers have a similar sort of charged relationship with America. I don't know. I'll hand over to you, Karan.
No, I think you put your finger on it. I think the canon here is much younger. It's in development, and there isn't a kind of direct historical relationship with America that is charged. So like, this is a very imprecise comparison, but I think that there's a way in which being an Indian, second generation, first generation immigrant in Britain, third generation even, is carries some of the feelings of shame, humiliation, resentment that Black Americans might feel in America, right? Like there's a deep historical wound there that is constantly with you. I think that the relationship between Indian writers here and America itself is like something that is pretty inchoate and like will need to be figured out book by book. And like I think some very interesting but more slant-wise work is likely to emerge from that.
Yeah.
That's my sense.
I think,
yeah.
No, I think, and it just strikes me that there's a class issue here, whereas a lot of the families who came in to the UK, they're very working class. My grandfather worked in, an iron forgery, and whereas, as a lot of families, pretty much in the UK who came over from India did, whereas my impression is that the migration to the US, which happened later, as you said, were more an educated class, I'd say, or a more educated class who came over to work in the university cities as well. So there's that class distinction. But I think you're right. I think the result may well be that the Indian American writers will write, while the British Asian writers are busy trying to work out work out of that wound and work out of their kind of immigrant sense, and how that kind of like just overwhelms perhaps the fiction to a degree. Perhaps Indian American writers will go off in much more freer direction, and we'll look at other aspects of fiction and make it come alive in more interesting ways. It can be. I think it must be quite a. I imagine it will be quite a freeing sense to not feel like you have that burden to write about.
Perhaps. So it's always been on the other side. I think it could be a lot more boring, is my sense. But I think you're right. Like talking of the types of immigrants here, Jhumpa Lahiri is a good example, right? Like her fiction is about professors, children of professors. It's a post 1965 more upper caste Indians, and that's interesting in its own right. But it's very different from the kind of stuff you write or the kind of stuff Hanif Qureshi writes. So yeah, I think that was a great question from Alison, and clearly one we could go on talking about for a long time. Emilia Coates asks, this is a question for both Sunjeev and Karan. For someone who is starting to write, what advice would you give to them that you wish you would have known when you started writing?
That I wish I'd known when I started writing. I mean, there's no getting around the fact that, it's just writing a novel is just grim persistence. That's all. It's just sitting down, turning up, the coffee long cold, and just wrong sentence after wrong sentence. That's all. That Beckettian thing of just failing again and again and again until you're happy with the level of failure is as small as you can make it. There's no great secret to it, and when it does go wrong, I find sitting with it quietly, and because narrative is generous, it will give you. I've said this before. It will give you the answers if you sit down with it and if you're patient with it, it will kind of reveal the answers to you, and it will shift, and suddenly you'll see a path which may well not get you to the end, but it will lead to another path which does. So yeah, that's not really advice, but it might sound disheartening, but it's just sitting down grimly facing the page.
Yeah, I'll add that sounds right, and that it's I think the part that I found hardest is that I hadn't recognized how much it does become an entire way of life, because in order to write truthfully, you do feel like you have to constantly grow as a person. And in some ways, I wish I weren't a writer and I wasn't being forced to grow as a person. It'd be much easier to just be like a schmuck. Whereas, like, if you want to gain any distance from your experiences and introspect about them, it's going to lead you into places that can be upsetting, can be hard for other people who are going to read it. It's a wonderful thing to do, but I sometimes do think that I could turn to my 20-year-old self and say, like, do something else.
Do something else. Yeah. I mean, it's for all me saying that it's grim, it's worth perhaps saying that it does. Certain aspects do get easier, like certain technical things, of craft. I guess you become a bit more learned and a bit more agile in the way you can get things down on the page. I mean, it's always hard, but it's if you start, over time, not everything is always hard. Some things do get a little more manageable.
Diego Benitez on Facebook asks a question about research, which you already talked about, but he asks specifically, were you surprised by anything you found in the process of research, whatever that might mean for you, whether that's just gossip or being nosy about people's lives, like something surprising?
Surprised by something in the research. I was surprised that one of the in the kind of the contemporary Strand, there's a character called Radhika, who's a doctor. Who's probably I love her. I think she's probably my, if I'm allowed to have favourite, she probably is my favourite character. And she's a doctor, and she's very much interested in female agency and the role of women and children. And one of the things I did find out was, this is just grim, but how the differences between the north of India and the south of India in terms of things like rates of female infanticide and education and health and caste, and it just felt that divide was just quite, on several of those metrics, was just quite stark. I don't think I quite appreciated how stark it is, really.
Last couple of questions, which I think we have about 5 minutes left. Jason asks, migration is a common theme in your work. For non-migrants, what is something you wish they could take away when reading your book? I know that's tough because you probably the whole book in some ways, but if there's something that comes to mind, that'd be helpful.
Take away from reading my book. It was striking to me, not so much with this novel, but with my last novel, which is about economic migrants from Punjab to the UK. And when I was doing kind of like Q&As and promoting that book, it was in the middle of the what was called the Syrian refugee crisis, and how often, and literally there were 3 interviews on the trot where the opening question was, it'd be great to know what you've written a book about migrants, it'd be great to know what you thought about the Syrian refugee crisis. And that's fine. Writers kind of can and should be asked what they think about the topics of the day, and occasionally they might even say something interesting about it. But it belies the idea that the sense that migrants and refugees and asylum seekers are all sort of interchangeable in some sense, that they're all one single other. And I suppose if, not that I write novels for any sort of take-home message or any rationale in that sense, but I suppose recognizing the particularity of these lives and of these situations might be something worth taking on board.
Great. And the last question is from Arpan, who says, in a recent Guardian article you wrote about how little we talk about class in the UK, do you feel burdened to write about class, immigration, or any other topic, or is it something which naturally weaves itself into the narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about class and race and capitalism and how they all kind of collapse on each other and how they intersect, and how little we talk about it in the UK, at least, for ages. But I don't feel a burden. I didn't even realize until kind of partway, quite late in the writing of my novels, that all my characters are really working class, or even perhaps what gets called in the UK at least an underclass. It was something that it's just there. It's like, it's like the weather, or it's just what I know and what I feel closest able to write about. So there's no pressure as such. I don't feel pressure to write about anything. It's just the subjects that feel most alive and most vital for me on the page, and I guess that's just, you have to just follow that and write it. I can't, as you'll know, it's just impossible to write things. I might love to write a novel about another world and with different kinds of people, and perhaps one day I will, but it's not something you can force in any way.
Thank you so much, Sunjeev.
Thank you both so much. What an amazing, insightful event for tonight. To our audience members, if you still haven't made a purchase of Sunjeev's latest novel, China Room, you could do so by pressing the green link at the bottom of the screen. Thank you both so much. If you guys have any final words before we head out.
Thanks to Karan, thanks to the Strand, thanks to you, Savi. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you guys. Have a good evening, everybody. Take care.